The Knowledgeable Provider podcast is educational, entertaining, and not the same as medical training. The information presented here should not be used by anyone to diagnose or treat any medical condition in themselves or others. If you need medical advice, go see your own knowledgeable medical provider. Opinions expressed on the podcast are solely those of the people expressing them and are not necessarily representative of any other entities. Other than lunches at the office, I do not receive any sort of compensation from pharmaceutical or medical device companies, and I have no other relevant financial disclosures. It's all fun and games until someone gets sued, am I right? Okay, on with the show. Hello, welcome back to Knowledgeable Provider. I'm your host, Jody Marks. I want to talk about this situation with the ACA subsidies that are about to expire. Not because I actually want to talk about it, but because it's going to affect our patients. And as much as I feel that clinical medicine people should not have to worry so much about insurance and financial stuff in medicine, that's really not the world we live in, at least not in the United States. It's pretty hard to have a discussion about any kind of treatment, be that medication or seeing another provider or a service like home health or physical therapy, medical devices, really anything that doesn't just involve giving somebody advice. You have to talk about how much it's going to cost the patient, whether or not it's covered by insurance. And if I've never said this before, pretty sure I have, but just in case, I think the whole system sucks. I think it sucks for patients. I think it sucks for providers. I think the only winners in the American healthcare system right now are insurance companies and maybe pharmaceutical companies. And I think a lot of this would be solved if we just had a single payer system. I may not know enough about that whole topic to even get into it, and I probably need to do a deep dive on that someday on the podcast. But it sure seems like things would be easier and make a lot more sense if we all just had Medicare and we didn't have to worry about who is allowed to have what. I know there are a lot of arguments against single payer. I know there's a lot of pushback against quote-unquote socialized medicine. And again, that's probably beyond the scope of my knowledge to even be talking about. But there's my personal opinion on how bad the whole system sucks. So with that said, I do want to talk about what's about to happen with people's health insurance premiums. Just as a refresher, or if you are not sure what this whole situation with the Affordable Care Act subsidies even means, back in 2014, the Affordable Care Act, also known as Obamacare, put a cap on how much people with ACA marketplace plans pay for their health insurance premiums as a percentage of their income on a sliding scale. So under a certain level, the less money you make, the less money you have to pay for your health insurance. And that is a permanent situation. Those are not the subsidies that are going away. The Affordable Care Act put that in place, and it's a permanent thing. What we're talking about going away now are the enhanced tax credits that came about in 2021 as part of the Inflation Reduction Act that increased the amount of financial assistance people get for their health insurance. Those had been extended until the end of this year. Of course, we went through a big government shutdown, and the big issue that the Democrats were trying to hold out for was to have these subsidies continued. They ended the shutdown. However, it looks like they're not going to extend the subsidies. So just to give you an idea of who benefits from this, the original subsidies from the 2014 Affordable Care Act provide assistance to people whose household income is up to 400% of the federal poverty level. That's a calculation that changes every year, is set by Health and Human Services. In 2025, the federal poverty level for an individual, one person, is an annual income of $15,650, which means individuals making up to $62,600, which is 400% of that, would be eligible for some government assistance in their healthcare costs. The federal poverty level goes up as the number of family members in a household goes up. So for a family of 4, the current federal poverty level is $32,150 household income. So 400% of that would be $128,600. That number keeps on going up as the size of the family increases. For a family of 8, the federal poverty level is $54,150. For 9 plus people in the family, you just add $5,500 for each extra person. And as that income goes up, the amount that people are required to pay for their insurance premium also goes up, right? So up to about 140%, so 1.5 times the federal poverty limit. Currently, people are paying $0 toward their health insurance premium. Once you get up to the 400% of federal poverty level range, people are currently paying about 8.5%, so $5,500 annually toward their premiums. That's for an individual. The percentages are about the same for a family of four. So at 400% of the federal poverty level with a family of four, that family is paying up to $11,050 annually for their health insurance. So when these subsidies expire, the amount of tax credit that people get is going to drop. So what dollar amount does that actually translate into because these enhanced subsidies are not being renewed? An individual at the federal poverty level is going to see an annual increase of about $378, go up to about 350% of the federal poverty level. So that'd be about $55,000 annually for an individual. That person is going to see about a $1,500 a year increase in their premiums. For a family of four, at 120% of federal poverty level, so that's $40,000 household income for a family of four, that family is going to see an $840 a year increase in their premiums, going up to about 350% of the federal poverty level, so that's about $110,000 household income for a family of four. That family's premium is going to increase by $3,200 a year. So those are pretty significant numbers. Those are pretty significant cost increases. When you're talking about this stuff in the aggregate, without looking at an individual person or an individual family's financial situation, I think it's sort of hard to understand how this will impact actual people. Everybody's situation is so different. I will say, just from my own observations in talking to individual patients, it seems like most people are kind of always operating at the limit of what they can afford. But again, that varies a lot from patient to patient. Sometimes I'll be talking to a patient and they'll be complaining about how much their medicine costs. And I'll say, well, how much did you have to pay? And they'll go, it was $20 for a month prescription, And then other people will say, yeah, I can afford to pay $1,500 a month for this medicine. So everybody's situation is so different. I think it's hard to really understand how big the impact of these changes is going to be for some people. I already know of a couple of patients that our practice is losing because they're having to change to a cheaper insurance plan that we're not preferred providers for. So that sucks for us and sucks for them, assuming they didn't want to leave. I think anything that ends up costing people more money is just kind of a slap in the face, I don't have a ton of economic data or research or knowledge to back this up, but it's expensive to live these days. I think we all feel that the cost of living has gone up, and it just makes things harder. I personally am for anything that keeps healthcare costs down for patients. So obviously, I wish they would keep these subsidies in place. In the interest of fairness, I will talk about sort of the opposite view of why some people think these subsidies should be allowed to expire. This is an article from the Cato Institute that I'm looking at. The Cato Institute is a libertarian sort of think tank in DC. They put out an article in October called 6 Reasons to Not Extend the Enhanced Obamacare Subsidies. And here are their 6 reasons. The Congressional Budget Office estimates that permanently extending those enhanced subsidies would increase the national deficit by $350 billion over 10 years, plus another $60 billion in interest costs to finance that spending. Reason number 2 is that these enhanced subsidies are available to people who make over the limit of the 400% of the federal poverty level cap. So the way they put it is funds the well-off. And, you can argue that the federal poverty level is quite low. And I think just the simple fact that the initial subsidies were available to people who make up to 4 times the federal definition of poverty is an inherent statement that that's a really low number. When I was single working as a nurse and a paramedic, I'm pretty sure I made well over $65,000 a year, which would be 400% of the federal poverty level. And I kind of felt like I was scraping by at times. And part of that's just my personal situation. But again, it's hard to know how these things are going to affect individual people. Reason number 3 from the Cato Institute is that a lot of these premium tax credits actually are not paid to individual customers, but are paid in advance to the insurance companies. So the individual's premium is lower because the government is giving money directly to the insurance companies. And one of the big Republican talking points right now is that they're putting forward a plan that might give that money directly to individuals in the form of like a health savings account or something like that. And I think that's a pretty good point. That goes back to the whole situation of insurance companies, I think, are the whole problem to begin with. And it's kind of funny to see all this dancing around. What I see as the central issue is that insurance companies suck and are really the reason that our healthcare costs are out of control. and why it's so hard for patients and providers alike. That would be, of course, a big criticism of the Affordable Care Act in the first place, is that instead of trying to fix the underlying problem, it just sort of doubled down. The big push of the Affordable Care Act was to get people enrolled in health insurance plans instead of trying to change the underlying model. But that's neither here nor there. The fourth reason from the Cato Institute is, quote, rampant enrollment fraud, unquote. There's a report from Paragon that estimates that there are more than 6.4 million improper enrollees into these marketplace plans. I listened to an interview on PBS with Brian Blaze, who's the president of the Paragon Health Institute that research came from, along with Jonathan Cohn, or Kahn, I'm not sure how to pronounce it, who is a writer at The Bulwark. And it seems like a lot of the fraudulent enrollment is happening because in some places, insurance brokers have been allowed to more easily enroll people in the marketplace plan. So there's like a middleman operating there. And it seems like a lot of the fraudulent stuff is happening because of those middlemen brokers. That's not something I know a lot about, but there it is. The next reason from the Cato Institute, high cost for little patient value. I guess the thought is if these subsidies expire, a lot of people will choose to not buy health insurance at all and spend their money on other things like, I don't know, food, gasoline, frivolous things like that, electricity. They point out that a lot of people with these health insurance plans don't actually use their coverage at all. I don't know that that's a fair point. I mean, the whole point of insurance, especially if you're a younger, healthier person who doesn't need to take a bunch of medicine or have a bunch of visits with medical providers, etc. The fact is that if something happens to you, if you have a car accident, if you have a heart attack, if something major happens to you that you don't see coming, the bill for all that is going to be outrageous. And so even if you don't really need healthcare on a day-to-day basis, you kind of have to carry health insurance unless you're independently wealthy. Because if something catastrophic like that happens, I mean, it's easily hundreds of thousands of dollars that you're going to end up owing somebody. So I don't think it's fair to use the fact that a lot of people don't utilize their health insurance coverage as a justification for taking it away. Because, again, back to a flaw in the design of this whole healthcare system, you can't afford it if something bad happens to you. So you have to have health insurance. One of the original provisions of the Affordable Care Act was that there was a penalty if you did not have health insurance that you had to pay come tax time, if I remember correctly. The thought there being that, let's say something does happen to you, you have to go in the hospital, you rack up a big bill, and you just can't pay. Well, somebody still has to pay for that care. Even if the hospital is going to come after you for collections and you go to court and you get your wages garnished and whatever happens, somebody still has to pay for all that care. And a lot of times it is the hospitals eating the cost of that. So I assume the thought there was by forcing people to buy health insurance, we can reduce the cost to hospitals / the government who's going to end up paying for it anyway. That was one thing that the Supreme Court overturned. That was one of the provisions of the Affordable Care Act that went away. So there's no longer that penalty for not having health insurance. And again, I'm probably not qualified to make a judgment about whether that was good or bad, but there it is. The final reason from the Cato Institute to get rid of these subsidies is, quote, temporary emergencies should not justify permanent entitlements, unquote. We all know that the government spent a lot of money during the pandemic to try to help mitigate the crisis. Remember all that time that COVID vaccines and Paxlovid and COVID tests were free. Of course, they weren't free. They were being subsidized by the government. There were several times that we just got checks from the government to help people who are out of work. There's all kinds of different tax credits. There's a child tax credit, earned income tax credit. All that came about during COVID just to try to help people get by. And the argument here is that that was a crisis. We should go back to how it was before since the crisis is over. I guess I don't have a strong opinion about that. I mean, it makes sense that if the crisis is over, we could go back to what we were doing before. But I'm also for the government doing everything they can to make things easier for people, especially people who don't have a lot of money. So I don't know. I'm neutral on that one. Again, I'm not necessarily trying to argue for or against any of this. Here it is. So that's where we are with these subsidies. I would guess that most of us are going to have a few patients on either end of the spectrum, some who are going to be devastated by this and some who it doesn't matter to them at all. And most people probably somewhere in the middle where they're going to grumble about having to spend a few $100s more a year on their health insurance premiums, and that'll be it. I see it as just a pretty interesting commentary, whether you feel positively or negatively about it. It's an interesting example of the pitfalls of our healthcare system being set up the way it is in the United States. I hope this was somewhat informative for you. I learned some stuff doing the research for this. Of course, I'll put links to all the articles and resources that I looked at for this in the show notes. I hope everyone's having a great holiday season. Thank you so much for listening. Special thanks to our Patreon supporters. You guys are the best. I hope you all have a good week, and I'll talk to you later. All right, that does it for this episode of Knowledgeable Provider. Very special thank you to our Patreon supporters. If you would like to help support the show for just $5 a month, please head over to patreon.com/knowledgeableprovider. If you're looking for more content, check out our YouTube channel and our Facebook page. Remember, all of those ratings, reviews, likes, follows, subscriptions, etc. really do help the show, so take a second and do those things to help me out. If you have a request for an episode topic or if you'd like to be a guest on the show, I'd love to hear from you. Email me anytime at thekppod@gmail.com. That's thekppod@gmail.com. Thanks so much for listening, and as always, stay safe, take care of yourself, and take care of your patients, in that order. And they have an article called 6 Reasons, and they put out an article back in October called 6 Reasons Not to Extend the Extended. And they put out an article back in October called 6 Reasons Not to Extend. They put in, God damn it.